Hello, I'm Karen Bronson, and thank you for being here today. This lecture is based on my dissertation titled Through His Own Words, an Exploration of the Pedagogy of Robert Marcellus. Marcellus was one of America's greatest and most influential clarinetists and teacher. In his 50-year music career, Marcellus contributed to the musical field as an orchestral player, conductor, and most notably as a professor. He performed in the prestigious Cleveland Orchestra for 20 years, after which he taught at Northwestern University. His pedagogy continues to impact current and future generations as it is passed down through former students. Robert Marcellus was born in Omaha, Nebraska on June 1st, 1928. He began his musical training with studying piano at the early age of 4 and clarinet at the age 11. The following year, Marcellus's family moved to Minneapolis. At age 13, he began his studies with the bass clarinetist of the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra, Earl Hanlon. By the age of 16, after moving to Washington, D.C., he commuted to New York City to study with Daniel Bonnard. At the young age of 17, Marcellus began his orchestral career, which at the time made him the youngest clarinetist ever to be hired by a major orchestra. He was second clarinetist with the National Symphony Orchestra from 1945 to 46. He then served in the United States Air Force Band in Washington, D.C. for 3 years. At the completion of his service, he returned to the National Symphony Orchestra and became principal clarinetist the following year. He remained with that orchestra until George Zell appointed him to the Cleveland Orchestra in 1953. Although primarily performing as an orchestral musician, Marcellus did have the opportunity to perform solo and chamber music repertoire. In 1956, he performed the Mozart Concerto and the Hindemith Concerto, both with the Cleveland Orchestra. 5 years later, Marcellus produced a highly acclaimed recording of the Mozart Concerto. That summer, he also performed the Mozart Concerto with the Casals Festival in Puerto Rico. As a chamber musician, he performed with the Lincoln Center Chamber Music Society in their debut concerts at Alice Tully Hall and performed with the same ensemble at the Kennedy Center. Unfortunately, in 1973, Marcellus's playing career ended after he experienced a retinal hemorrhage due to the onset of diabetes, forcing him to retire from performance. After Marcellus left, the Cleveland Orchestra honored his service by endowing the principal clarinet chair in his name. Marcellus's orchestral performances were not limited to clarinet playing. He was a guest conductor with numerous orchestras such as the Minnesota Orchestra, Detroit Symphony, St. Louis Little Symphony, National Arts Center at Ottawa, Atlantic Symphony, and Interlochen World Youth Symphony Orchestra. During his tenure with Cleveland Orchestra, Marcellus taught at Cleveland Institute for Music and during the summer months at Blossom Festival. After he left the Cleveland Orchestra, Marcellus taught at Northwestern University for nearly 20 years. While at Northwestern University, he taught a series of summer masterclasses from 1977 to 1990. The primary source of my research for my dissertation was gathered from recorded archives from these masterclasses. These archives are freely available to the public online through Northwestern University libraries. I gathered data for this research by transcribing several of these sessions. Once data was collected, the pedagogical approaches that I found were organized by topics and were provided with relevant musical examples. Daniel Bonnard, George Zell, and Pablo Casals were all major influencers in shaping Marcellus's pedagogical approaches. Marcellus was further influenced by Marcel Tabouteau and William Kincaid, whom performed with Daniel Bonnard during the golden era of the Philadelphia Orchestra. Additionally, Marcellus frequently quoted clarinet pedagogical terms used by Alexander Selmer. When Marcellus referred to his pedagogical methods in the master classes, he called it a précis of study or a summary of study. His pedagogy can be broken down into three major categories. The first category is tone production, including wind, embouchure, and articulation. The second category is fingers and hand position. And the third category of his methodology is phrasing analysis. Marcellus used the term wind to describe airspeed. He believed that the proper usage and speed of wind are the most important aspects of clarinet playing. Marcellus once commented that wind has everything to do with the quality of sound, efficiency of tone production, and has a lot to do with articulation. Many of Marcellus's teaching principles followed the traditions of the great Marcel Tabiteau, William Kincaid, and Daniel Bonnard, all who taught the high woodwinds at the Curtis Institute and played in the Philadelphia Orchestra in the 1930s. He referred to them as the Great Trilogy of Teaching. Their concept on breathing was that the whole abdominal wall should stay in a very nice outward or flexed position, meaning the lungs can collapse while blowing, but the chest should stay well extended while supporting from the abdomen. Kincaid and Tabiteau described this concept of pushing out and down with the abdomen while blowing. The abdominal support muscle should stay flexed outward and expand like a balloon while blowing. This helps to sustain the sound at the end of phrases. Marcellus also talked about how Tabiteau and Kincaid put a great deal of emphasis on speed of wind. Marcellus said, quote, "Now speed of wind is not that kind of intensity will produce a loud sound. Speed of wind is generally contoured somehow by not having an open throat and by not dropping the tongue," end quote. Marcellus stated that secondary to the importance of wind are three important concepts: the shape of the oral cavity while playing, the lips, and the jaw. The shape of the oral cavity is largely dependent on the position of the tongue in the mouth. Many clarinet teachers, such as Marcellus, used vowel sounds to describe the proper shape of the oral cavity. Alan Balter quoted Marcellus saying, "The best vowel sound to think of while you play is the umlaut U." Distinguished modern pedagogue Larry Guy best described the vowel sound by breaking it down into two parts: the French tu and the German umlaut U, which is like saying O and U combined. Basically, O creates the lip position and E creates the tongue position. O, U. Marcellus believed that the tongue should be in the talking part of the mouth and used the syllable E as a common tongue placement in the mouth. He stated that if the tongue is dropped too low in the oral cavity, which is synonymous with an open throat, the wind slows down. In the upper register, he referred to Alexander Selmer's suggestion of using the syllable E. This type of voicing can also be compared to whistling. By whistling different pitches, the tongue moves to different heights in the mouth. Marcellus felt that by whistling a throat tone A flat, the tongue was in the correct position for the Chalumeau register. A middle line B works for the clarion register, and whistling a C sharp above that is correct for the altissimo register. Since it is difficult to see the proper shape of the oral cavity, this method gives clear and concise guidelines as to the shape of the oral cavity while playing in different registers of the clarinet. Equal to the importance of the oral cavity is having a properly formed lip muscle. Clarinetists have two options regarding the type of embouchure they will use: single lip, where the upper teeth are on the mouthpiece, or double lip, where the upper lip is between the teeth in the mouthpiece. Marcellus taught and played single lip embouchure, which was the more conventional method employed in the United States. He felt that both the upper lip and lower lips should be flat, and that the upper lip should be slightly tucked under itself in the center of the top lip. The upper lip should have a downward pressure, creating almost a lever by which the pressure of the lower lip is controlled. Marcellus cautioned against resting the reed on the fleshy part of the lower lip, since that approach can be problematic because of the limited endurance and consistency that can be achieved. I also feel that it can reduce the amount of color and vibrancy in the sound. Marcellus quoted the great Alexander Selmer, who described the embouchure as rubber bands around the mouthpiece. This is an effective visual description of how the lips should function with equal pressure from all points. It is my view that this is where the upper lip derives its importance. By pushing down into the mouthpiece with the upper lip, the rest of the mouth is more engaged. Marcellus said that Larry Combs, the clarinetist with Chicago Symphony, once told him, "You know, the top lip is 75% of the embouchure." Marcellus stated that the jaw must be very stable while playing, and one must learn to use the tongue totally independent of the jaw. He was an advocate of light jaw pressure and that you should avoid biting the reed. When teaching students how to form a proper embouchure, Marcellus advised, think of a triangle whose 3 points are located at the corners of the mouth and at the point or dimple of the chin. These 3 points should be felt as one entity. One connects the dots by feeling the muscles which made up the sides of the triangle. Note that Marcellus does not specifically say anything about the corners of the embouchure. However, it is commonly accepted for the corners to be pushed inward toward the mouthpiece and not pulled back away from the mouthpiece. Marcellus stated that articulations are speech on the reed, as in saying ta 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 ta, do 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 do, or dee 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 dee. When Marcellus taught articulation to a student, he preferred to first introduce it with stopped staccato. When describing staccato, Marcellus said, "A stopped articulation doesn't mean a crude sounding stop, but a retention of the wind intensity. With a consistent, well-supported wind column, the tongue is only a valve which starts and stops the tones, however short. Each tone should be carved out of the best possible wind-supported sound. The idea of blowing a wind column forte and playing piano or pianissimo with the tongue and well-stopped articulation is a wonderful thing to learn, which is needed when we play Mendelssohn's Scherzo from Midsummer's Night's Dream." Most of his philosophy on tonguing came from his teacher Bonnade and followed the principles in Bonnade's book, The Clarinetist Compendium. For instance, the stop staccato exercise. Here, students blow an open G and suddenly stop it with the tongue on the reed while keeping consistent pressure of wind. Then the staccato exercise is played with the same principle where the tongue stays on the reed and moves on and off quickly for each staccato. Marcellus believed that fingers should stay in a gentle, relaxed, curved position to maintain independent finger dexterity. He stated that flattening out of fingers should be avoided because it's clumsy when closing the holes. He felt it was important to keep a common curve to the hands because there was a lot of architectural strength in curved fingers. To position fingers on the clarinet, Marcellus would have students work on one hand at a time by placing the fingers on the tone holes without use of the thumbs. The center of the fleshy part of the fingertips should cover the center of the tone holes. The fingers should stay curved as if they were holding a tennis ball. Next, they would move their thumb in place, keeping the fingers curved, but without pressure or tension. To teach finger movement, Marcellus applied the principle of legato fingers, which refers to the technique required to play smoothly during slow, slurred passages. Marcellus stressed that the fingers are secondary to the wind, and to play smoothly from note to note requires what he called playing between the notes. This concept involves sustaining the speed of air while fingers are lifting and placing. Any banging of the fingers, clicking of the keys, or squeezing should be avoided. Bonnard taught this technique by raising the fingers very high and bringing them down slowly to the keys. Marcellus was a proponent of Bonnard's finger motions exercise from the Clarinetist Compendium. Marcellus's method of identifying different types of phrases was based on the influence of Daniel Bonnard. When identifying a phrase structure, Marcellus stated that there are four basic ground rules: Appoggiatura phrase, melodic phrase, rhythmic phrase, and harmonic phrase. Marcellus used the slow etudes from Rowe's 40 studies to demonstrate Appoggiatura phrases. The term Appoggiatura is defined as a non-chord tone approached by a leap and resolved by moving a step. Most commonly, appoggiaturas are approached and resolved with motion in opposite directions. However, it is possible for appoggiaturas to be approached and left with a leap in the same direction. Marcellus used the term appoggiatura loosely to describe any non-chord tone that occur on a strong beat and function as the focal point of the phrase. He did not take into consideration the required leap on the approach to the appoggiatura. Rather, Marcellus simply defined appoggiaturas as a leaning tone on a strong beat. In other words, a dissonant tone before the true tone resolves. This is best described as follows: suspensions and accented passing tones, neighbor tones, and appoggiaturas strike the listener with greater force and effect. They may be said to have the character of resistance or leaning on the note to which they eventually resolve. And for this reason, some theorists refer to all accented passing tones, neighbor tones, and appoggiaturas and rearticulated suspensions as appoggiaturas based on the Italian word appoggiare, which means to lean. Here are a few examples of what Marcellus referred to as appoggiatura phrases. These examples are from Rowe's 40 studies that were played by students in the summer master classes. As seen here, the phrases are rearticulated suspensions, but act as appoggiaturas. Marcellus would have students crescendo to the lean note and decrescendo away from it. The second type of phrase that Marcellus defined is a melodic phrase. Simply defined, the melodic phrase is one in which the shape of the line follows the contour of the melodic line. Marcellus frequently called this type of phrase the Casals phrase. Pablo Casals, who was known for his expressive cello playing, commented that when playing this type of musical line, you follow the rise and fall of the notes. These examples show how the dynamics follow the line. Notice the dynamic with the Beethoven excerpt. A common way to play this is to decrescendo to the high E. Marcellus applied dynamics that follow the direction of the line, which makes this phrase more melodic. The third type of phrase is a rhythmic phrase. Syncopation, accents, or brilliant technical passages dictate a rhythmic phrase. This example shows an accent on the double B flat. Even though this is a descending line, the first two notes would not decrescendo as in a melodic phrase. Here, there should be separation in the line between the C and the B double flat to emphasize the accented note. The fourth type of phrase that Marcellus referred to is the harmonic phrase. This type of phrase is dictated by harmonic implications from the chordal structure underneath the melodic line. To demonstrate a harmonic phrase, Marcellus used the excerpt from the second movement of the Brahms Symphony No. 1. He mentioned that when he played this piece early in his career with the Cleveland Orchestra, George Zell corrected Marcellus on his dynamic level in measure 46. Marcellus played the two similar measures with the same dynamic level as indicated in the clarinet part. However, since there is a reharmonization in the cello and bass lines, measure 46 should be played softer. When discussing clarinet repertoire, Marcellus stated that we have a great repertoire. It's limited, but is absolutely super. Marcellus organized repertoire into 4 units he called categories of study or syllabus of study, which formed the curriculum for his students. This method created a continuity with studying etudes of great importance and should be followed with a daily practice routine. The 4 categories are finger and technique, legato and phrasing, articulation, and repertoire. The finger and technique category includes the Behrman Complete Method for Clarinet, Opus 63, 3rd Division, Yettl's The Accomplished Clarinetist, Closet's Method for Clarinet, Polachek's Advanced Studies, and the Ricordi edition of Stark Arpeggio Etudes. The legato and phrasing category includes the slower or moderate tempo of the Rose 40 Studies and 32 Etudes. For the category of articulation, Marcellus concentrated on the stop staccato method. For this, he used Bonad's The Clarinetist Compendium, Rose 40 Studies and 32 Studies, and the Stark Staccato Studies. The solo category included Weber's Concertino, which Marcellus considered to be a masterpiece. Next on the list is Mozart's Concerto, Debussy Premier Rhapsody, Weber's 2 concertos, the Hindemith Sonata, Poulenc Sonata, Copland Concerto, and the Solo de Concord pieces. Additional solos are the Bassi Rigoletto Fantasia, the 2 Brahms sonatas, Schumann Fantasy Pieces, Berg 4 pieces, Stamitz Concerto No. 3, Stravinsky 3 pieces, and Weber's Grand Duo Concertante. Chamber pieces include Bartók's Contrasts, Beethoven Trio, Schubert Shepherd on the Rock, and the Mozart Quintet. The orchestral excerpts that he included are all the standard pieces by Beethoven, Brahms, Mendelssohn, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff, Ravel, Shostakovich, and Stravinsky. In addition to having the categories of study, Marcellus believed very strongly in applying a systematic progression of studies and repertoire. The sequence of study he used with his students was the Closet, the Behrman 3rd Division, Rose 40 Studies, followed by the 32 Etudes. Next were the Rode Etudes Cavallini, the Ricordi edition, the Behrman 4th and 5th Divisions, and Jean 18 and 16 Studies. In summary, Marcellus's précis of study focused on wind, embouchure, articulation, and fingers, with the most important one being the wind. Marcellus identified 4 types of phrase structure and stressed with his students the importance of conducting phrase analysis to know one's musical path. Thank you for watching and listening to this lecture on the pedagogy of Robert Marcellus. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.